Let's start with something most of us don't want to admit. We are far more comfortable believing words than we are confronting patterns. Words are easy. They're polished, intentional, and often designed to reassure us. Patterns, on the other hand, require observation, patience, and a willingness to accept what we see even when it contradicts what we hoped was true. This is where character quietly reveals itself. When someone tells you who they are, they're offering a version of themselves. But when you watch what they repeatedly do, especially under pressure, in conflict, or when there's nothing to gain, that's where you encounter their character. Not in isolated incidents, not in carefully crafted apologies, but in consistent behavior over time. One of the most overlooked warning signs is the refusal to take accountability, not just once, but as a pattern. Pay attention to how someone responds when things go wrong. Do they reflect, or do they deflect? Do they take ownership, or do they instinctively shift blame onto circumstances, other people, or even you? Accountability is not just about admitting fault, it's about demonstrating a willingness to grow. When that willingness is absent, what you're left with is a fixed pattern of avoidance. And avoidance over time becomes a form of dishonesty. This is something Brené Brown speaks to with remarkable clarity. Integrity is choosing courage over comfort. And avoiding accountability is, at its core, choosing comfort, protecting one's ego at the expense of truth. When you see this repeatedly, it's not a flaw you can fix in someone else. It's a boundary you have to recognize for yourself. Another pattern that often goes ignored is inconsistency, not the kind that comes from being human. We all have off days, but a deeper, more strategic inconsistency. Someone who is kind when it's convenient, present when it benefits them, and distant when it doesn't. This creates confusion, and confusion is powerful. It keeps you engaged, questioning, trying to figure them out. But here's the hard truth. Inconsistency is not mystery, it's information. It tells you that their behavior is conditional, and conditional behavior erodes trust. Not all at once, but slowly, subtly, until you find yourself adjusting your expectations just to maintain the relationship. You start accepting less clarity, less reliability, less respect, because you're holding on to the moments when they asterisk those things. But character isn't defined by occasional highs. It's defined by consistent standards. Then there's the absence of empathy, which is often more visible in what someone dismisses than in what they say. Watch how a person responds to other people's pain, not just yours. Do they minimize it? Do they mock it? Do they show indifference unless it directly affects them? Empathy isn't selective. It's a way of engaging with the world. When it's missing, relationships become transactional. People are valued based on usefulness, not humanity. And that has consequences, because without empathy, there's no real accountability, no genuine connection, and no sustainable trust. What you're left with is a dynamic where your needs, your boundaries, and even your experiences can be invalidated without hesitation. And if you stay in that dynamic long enough, you begin to question your own perception of reality. That's not accidental. That's the impact of ignoring patterns. Disrespect for boundaries is another signal that often gets rationalized. It rarely shows up as something dramatic at first. It's subtle, a comment that crosses a line, a request that ignores your comfort, a repeated push after you've said no. Each instance might seem small enough to overlook, but taken together, they form a pattern that says your limits are negotiable. And they are not. Healthy character recognizes and respects boundaries even when they're inconvenient. Questionable character tests them, challenges them, and sometimes ignores them entirely. And when you repeatedly allow those boundaries to be crossed, you're not just tolerating behavior. You're participating in a pattern that diminishes your own sense of self. This is where the real work begins, because recognizing these patterns requires more than observation. It requires honesty, honest reflection about what you're seeing, and even more importantly, about what you've been willing to excuse. We don't ignore red flags because we don't see them. We ignore them because acknowledging them forces a decision. And decisions, especially the ones that involve distancing yourself from someone, are uncomfortable. They disrupt your expectations, your emotional investments, and sometimes your identity. But avoiding that discomfort comes at a cost. The longer you prioritize someone else's words over their patterns, the further you move away from your own clarity. And clarity, as Brené Brown reminds us, is an act of kindness not just toward others, but toward yourself. Because in the end, character is not hidden. It's revealed consistently in ways that are easy to explain away, but impossible to ignore without consequence. And the question you have to ask yourself is simple, but not easy. Are you paying attention to what people say, or are you finally ready to trust what they show you? Once you begin to see these patterns clearly, the conversation shifts because awareness on its own is not enough. The more difficult truth is what happens next. What happens when you recognize questionable character, and instead of responding to it, you explain it away, minimize it, or simply endure it. This is where the real cost begins to surface. Ignoring red flags is not a passive act. It's a decision, often a quiet one, repeated over time. That shapes your internal world. Every time you dismiss a moment that made you uncomfortable, every time you override your instinct to question something that felt off, you are teaching yourself a subtle but powerful lesson that your perception is negotiable, and over time that lesson compounds. You begin to hesitate before trusting your own judgment. You replay conversations not to understand them, but to reinterpret them in a way that feels less confronting. You search for alternative explanations that make the other person's behavior more acceptable, even when those explanations come at the expense of your own clarity. This is not weakness. It's a deeply human response to discomfort and emotional risk, but it comes with consequences that are often underestimated. One of the first things to erode is your sense of self-trust, and self-trust is foundational. It's what allows you to navigate relationships, make decisions, and set boundaries with confidence. When that trust begins to weaken, you don't just doubt others, you start doubting yourself. You question whether you're overreacting, whether you're being unfair, whether your expectations are too high. And in that space of doubt, tolerance expands. You start accepting behavior you once would have challenged, not because it aligns with your values, but because confronting it feels more difficult than accommodating it. This is how emotional standards gradually lower, not through a single moment of compromise, but through a series of small, almost imperceptible concessions. Brené Brown often speaks about the importance of boundaries as a form of self-respect. But boundaries are not just about what you say no to, they're about what you refuse to normalize. And when you repeatedly ignore red flags, you begin to normalize what should never have become familiar. Another cost, one that is often harder to recognize, is the internal fragmentation that occurs when your actions and your awareness are out of alignment. On some level, you know what you're experiencing. You see the inconsistency, the lack of accountability, the absence of empathy. But when your behavior, staying, tolerating, justifying contradicts that awareness, it creates tension. That tension doesn't disappear, it turns inward. You may feel it as anxiety, as restlessness, as a persistent sense that something isn't quite right. Not necessarily because of any one interaction, but because of the ongoing disconnect between what you know and what you allow. This is the psychological cost of self-betrayal, and it's one of the most profound consequences of ignoring character. Because at its core, this isn't just about the other person. It's about your relationship with yourself. There's also a philosophical dimension to this that's worth considering. Every relationship you remain in is, in some way, a reflection of what you're willing to accept as part of your reality. This doesn't mean you're responsible for someone else's behavior, but you are responsible for your continued participation in it. And participation, even when it's reluctant, has an effect. It shapes your expectations, your emotional capacity, and your sense of what is possible in connection with others. If you consistently engage with people whose character is questionable, you begin to internalize a version of relationships that is unstable, unpredictable, and often unfulfilling. Not because that's all that exists, but because that's what you've allowed to remain. And this is where courage becomes essential. Not the kind of courage that is loud or confrontational, but the quieter, more demanding kind. The courage to choose yourself in moments where it would be easier not to. The courage to step back, to create distance, to say, "This is not aligned with what I value," even when doing so disrupts your comfort or your expectations. It's important to understand that walking away from questionable character is not an act of rejection, it's an act of discernment. You are not making a statement about someone's worth as a human being. You are making a decision about what you are willing to integrate into your life. And that distinction matters because too often people stay in unhealthy dynamics out of a sense of obligation, empathy, or hope that things will change. But empathy without boundaries leads to exhaustion. Hope without evidence leads to stagnation. And obligation, when it overrides self-respect, becomes a quiet form of self-abandonment. The truth is, recognizing red flags gives you information. Acting on them requires intention. It requires you to trust that your well-being is not negotiable, that your peace is not something you earn by enduring discomfort, and that your standards are not barriers to connection, they